Okay, so this video is for early process of beginning to learn the somatosensory pathways. We're going to specifically talk about the fine discrimination touch, specifically from the body. Okay, so this is the body pathway. There's a separate pathway for the face and head. So we're going to begin the pathway with a mechanoreceptor. So, for instance, a Merkel's disc, right? You have the Merkel's disc, or you could have a Pacinian corpuscle, but something out in the periphery, on the periphery of the skin. So here's our little receptor, right? And that receptor is associated with a primary afferent axon, right? And by primary, that just means the first order. This is the first neuron in a serial pathway of neurons for the information to travel to consciousness. And it reaches consciousness when it reaches the cortex. Okay, so this is a first order neuron, and the cell body of that first order neuron for information from the body is located in the dorsal root ganglion. Okay, this is the DRG. When you hear the word ganglion, you should remember that that's a collection of cell bodies outside of the CNS. Right, so this is the PNS. Collection of cell bodies, it's first order cell bodies, it's the first neuron in the pathway. And this particular type of neuron is called a pseudo-unipolar neuron. Okay, so that's the name of the morphology. It has a very interesting morphology because the action potential begins out here and passes by its cell body and goes along the central portion of its axon. So the central portion of its axon will enter into the CNS, the spinal cord. Right, so here's the spinal cord. This is the midline. Okay, so it's going to enter in, and then it's going to continue ascending, right? So there's no synapse yet. This is all still the first order neuron in the pathway. It's going to ascend to the level of the brainstem, specifically the medulla. Okay, so when it gets to the medulla, then it's going to create a synapse with the second order neuron in the pathway. Okay. So this is the brainstem neuron. This is the second order neuron in the pathway. And now for all of these somatosensory pathways going to consciousness, the axon of the second order neuron always does the same thing. That is, it crosses the midline. And you'll see shortly why that's important. Okay? It's going to cross the midline of the brainstem. It's actually a very specific structure called the internal arcuate fibers, okay, but we'll talk about that in a second. So this is the cell body, the second order neuron. Its axon crosses the midline and then it ascends. Now this bundle of axons here that's conveying fine discrimination touch from the body is called the medial lemniscus. Okay, so this pathway is going to synapse in the thalamus. Okay, I'm going to have to make some more room. This is information from the body, so this is specifically going to be, this is somatosensory information from the body, so it's specifically the VPL, or ventro-posterior lateral nucleus of the thalamus. Give myself a little more room here. Okay, so what does this neuron do? We still got a midline. This neuron ascends ipsilaterally to the cortex. Okay. It's going to make a synapse on the fourth order neuron, right? So the VPL, thalamic neuron, that's the third order neuron in the pathway, and it's going to synapse on the fourth order neuron in the pathway. Okay, right? So this is primary somatosensory cortex. It's also called Brodmann's areas 3, 1, and 2, and it's located in the post-central gyrus, right? So that's just posterior to the central gyrus. That's the fourth order neuron in the pathway, and at this point the information has reached consciousness. There's something interesting about this particular pathway is that along the way, even before we get up to the thalamus, you can see the definition, you can see the division between upper and lower body. Okay, so that's true in the spinal cord. Okay, so from T6 and above, what you have is these axons are entering in, and they're going to travel in the dorsal part of the spinal cord, right? The dorsal part, dorsal white matter. Here's the gray matter. Little butterfly. Okay, so in the dorsal part of the white matter. And so at T6 and above, what you have is you have a little sulcus. It's called the posterior intermediate sulcus, such that the lower body is medial and the upper body is more lateral. Okay, so if this were, for instance, the T6 DRG, right, the DRG at the T6 level, you would already have the lower body would have already entered the cord beneath this, and it would be traveling up here. And now you have the T6 information, or thoracic dermatomes. That information will enter and lie adjacent to the information that's already in there, and thereby it creates the body map just simply by lying adjacent to the information that's already there. So here's the sulcus. Medial to the sulcus is lower body, lateral to it is upper body. Now you'll see the same thing at the level of the medulla. Okay, so at the level of the medulla, the brainstem's a very round structure. It's pretty round. It's my bad drawing here. Okay, and actually I drew these a little bit close to the midline, but so closer to the midline you will have the gracile nucleus. Actually I should write that in green. Right, so the gracile nucleus, it's a nucleus, so it's a collection of cell bodies within the CNS. Okay, so these are the second order cell bodies. Okay, so that's the gracile one, and just lateral to that is the cuneate. Okay, so this is lower, and this is upper body representations. You'll still have the full map once you get into the thalamus. In the thalamus, the head area will be medial and the legs will be the most lateral portion. In the cortex, it sort of switches around. The feet are most medial and the head is most lateral ventral as it comes down the gyrus. So this is the somatosensory information for fine discrimination touch, specifically from the body.